morning, everyone. Welcome from Vancouver Island, Canada. I'm Monica Carless, your host, and welcome to Conversations with the Universe. Today, I'm speaking with the wildly beautiful, talented, and intelligent Jumakae, who is a friend and a colleague, and I would like to welcome her to our space today. Welcome, June.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Fellow Saturn sister.
Hello. It's a very important day for me today, as we were speaking about pre-interview, that today is the climax of my second Saturn return. I am officially entering into Crondom. I'm very honored that I have managed to reach this stage in my life. I know there are other lifetimes where I did not, and so it is a great honor for me to share this time with June. And can I start out by just reading your bio so that people kind of know who the energy of you?
Sure.
Yeah, great, thank you. Jumakae is a professional artist, a wellness consultant, and a storytelling coach. She currently serves as a speaker's advocate in Lisa Nichols' program, Ignite Your Speaking, and is an assistant business coach to Shireen Sun's Muse Business Academy, educating clients on how to create their signature talks and workshops to serve as medicine for the masses. Woohoo, I love that. Through her additional practice as a wellness consultant, she is a 200-hour registered yoga teacher, trained to work with survivors of sexual trauma through peace over violence, and is a life doula with a professional certification from Leadership That Works. With her passion for the arts and somatic learning, she holds self-care and storytelling workshops for organizations and individuals to strengthen team relationships and wellness culture from a social justice and trauma-informed lens. That is a lot of good work. A lot of being of service in the world. Thank you, June.
Thank you so much for reading that bio, which it's been a reminder of just how far I've come, because I feel like for many of us who step into these types of roles as healers, oftentimes it's a result of our own wounding and a search for what it can look like to find alternative means to reclaim sovereignty over our bodies and our minds and our spirits.
Yeah, and that's a great lead into my question, which is, what does sovereignty mean to you, and how do you see that expressed in your life?
You know, sovereignty was never a word that I used because I tend to associate it with the monarchy, with royalty, with classism, but I love seeing this resurgence of folks, especially women of color, beginning to use this as a way to talk about what it means to have ownership over one's body, over one's spirituality, where we don't have to adapt to harmful systems or beliefs that are not in alignment with who we are today. And oftentimes that sovereignty looks like an excavation of our own ancestral roots, what has skipped multiple generations that many of us are slowly beginning to resurface, as well as creating new cultures and paradigm shifts of our own.
That really opened my eyes, because you know what? I have not ever associated the word sovereignty with monarchy. And as soon as you said it, it clicked for me that, yes, of course, it can also be associated with that. For me, sovereignty has always been associated with kind of the journey of women through the ages, and whether we had our own place, whether we had our own name, whether we had our own right to, you know, the things that we wanted to do and the things that we wanted to experience. And for so long, we haven't been sovereign And we've been taught that sovereignty was really undesirable, that we needed to stay in our place. So I'd like to bring that back up, that sovereignty piece for women and for us as a, you know, collective culture.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm. You do a lot of storytelling, and I know that a lot of what you do is helping people change the narratives of their lives, or at least be conscious of the narratives in their lives and how those narratives affect us. Can you speak a little bit about your work and what having our own narratives and being in control, like being sovereign in our narratives, means?
Yeah, so I have a lot of experience with public speaking. I'm
Mm.
formally trained in theater, and in my former life, I was a spoken word and hip hop artist. I know it's still in there,
Yeah.
but lately, these past couple of years has been a reclamation of being able to tell my stories in a way that feels unscripted, unstaged,
Mm-hmm.
and truly comes from this guttural place. And when I say guttural, I mean that not just as a metaphor, but physiologically, how is it that the stories we tell impact our bodies?
Mm-hmm.
And so, as you read, I do assistant coaching
Yes.
for public speakers with one of the top motivational speakers in the world. And yet and we, of course, we have very, very different clientele.
Mm.
For me, my
Yeah.
passion is working with healers who are still coming to terms with expressing what is it they do in the world, because I know that there's many healers who will say, oh, you're just going to have to experience it. But I believe that you can articulate what it is you do. It's just a matter of, are you truly embodying the power of your gifts?
Mm.
And I think oftentimes too, we tend to get stuck in the semantics of trying
Mm.
to explain what it is we do, as opposed to truly being present for the person we are serving. Because
Mm.
radical deep listening is sometimes the greatest gift we can give to
Mm.
anybody, as opposed to jumping straight into actions and being result oriented. So in regards to how, for me, storytelling and reclaiming our narratives is connected to the body, when I transitioned out of doing domestic violence work and started looking for alternative means of healing from my own sexual trauma that wasn't just rooted in the intellectualization of it, which
Mm.
is how so many
Yeah.
of us cope with trauma unknowingly, and
Yeah.
that is in part tied to colonization and this disembodiment of our being. I happened to stumble upon birth work,
Mm.
and I thought maybe I'm going to be a doula.
Okay.
So
Mm.
I started apprenticing with folks who worked specifically with vaginal health
Yeah.
and with uterus, and that with yoni steaming. I was an
Yeah.
apprentice in uh, with Steamy Chicks, guinea pig. I was one of her guinea pigs in her first
Yeah. Yeah.
program. Like everyone's like, what is this stuff? And that led me back to Thailand, my roots, to learn about the art of abdominal womb healing, which
Mm.
originally I thought was only specific to Mesoamerican culture, because those were my mentors here in Southern California. And it blew my mind to learn that these practices are essentially ancestral to all of us, not just folks of color either. And
Mm.
so, again, I think that that speaks to how colonization has impacted every single one of us. But going back to what I learned as a result of exploring body work,
Yeah.
is how things like cysts, fibroids, endometriosis are a result of the stories that we've been telling ourselves, especially for women or bodies who identify as empaths, right? Because not everybody who has a uterus identifies as a woman. I started noticing how so many of us are carrying stories that oftentimes do not belong to us, whether that is intergenerational or growing up in a household of trauma or witnessing it, and how that then manifests as inflammation in our bodies. And so it's not just with the uterus, it's even with our heart. How many of us are holding our shoulders enclosed because we're trying to protect something, or even with our digestive system. And I know for me, my whole life, I've had digestive issues, but I never knew that because I thought it was just normal. And so it forced me to look at the stories I have been telling myself from very, very early on. And no matter how many cleanses or diets that I can take on, that needs to be done alongside me reframing my narratives, the relationship that I have with my body, and also what are the stories I am telling myself of who it is I see when I look in the mirror. And I am striving to get to a place where that no longer is an issue, where body doesn't have to be the topic of conversation anymore, where I can just walk this world freely, feeling sovereign in this vessel, my very first home. So for me, if we want to talk about what it means to reframe your narrative or to speak your truth or to become a confident public speaker, it's going to go beyond just learning the skills and the strategies of how to shape the perfect story. It's going to start with those stories that we've been telling ourselves. It's going to start with looking at areas of our bodies that we have neglected or ignored, and what are the stories that those parts of our being are asking us to tell as well.
Wow, you've touched on so many important things there, and I see when I kind of look at your experience and the things that I know of you, and obviously I know very little of you, even though I think I know something of you, but just the things that I've experienced being in your presence, or, you know, when we've had chats, realizing what a tapestry your life has been, you know, and the things that you have been doing to find yourself where you're at right this minute. And you mentioned a few of the steps you have taken in order to discover yourself more. You know, you explored this path, then you explored that path. There's been all these pieces of yourself that you have explored, unearthed, gathered to yourself. And now you are in this place where you really understand where our stories are so incredibly important. And the way we frame those stories becomes also just as important, because our mind is going to create stories around the stories. Do you know what I mean? Like we're going to be discovering ourselves and what our story is, what our narrative is. And then our mind and our ego are going to work together to reframe those stories. And then we have to kind of unearth again. I see it kind of as a cycle. Do you see it as a cycle where we're kind of coming into a knowingness of ourselves, then we discover another part, reclaim another part, and we begin the cycle again of learning about ourselves again. The narrative begins again.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I feel like there's many people who believe that joy and pleasure and even sovereignty is the result of healing, as opposed to seeing those things as a form of healing. It is the way. Healing is not a destination. It is an embodiment. And so every single day, it is still a challenge for me. And I like to define challenges as opportunities for change, just like with enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
Like you can reach enlightenment, but you don't stay there forever unless you become Buddha.
Yeah.
Then, you know, okay, that's
Jesus.
a whole nother, you know, Jesus. Even then, I mean, we have stories with them as well. But I know, like for me, when I went to my first 10-day silent meditation retreat, I hated the experience until I got to this peak state. And when I left, I was feeling super blissed out. I felt like I had this secret that I was so ready to tell the world, especially after being silent for, you know, a week and a half.
Yeah.
And then the moment I turn on the TV and I see the news, my nervous system just went haywire and I couldn't sleep for 3 days. And so that experience taught me that the real work is out here, that every single day, whether I step outside of my home or I turn on my computer to see a news update on social media, I'm constantly being tested. And how often am I giving that power away to others, whether it is in the media or whether it is somebody else who is testing my boundaries. And so it's a practice to return back to this story that I am safe, that I belong, that I am protected. And I think that sometimes we can run the risk of spiritually bypassing the uncomfortable work of sitting with these emotions that we tend to label as negative, as opposed to seeing things like sadness or anger or fear as a compass, as an invitation to look at areas or parts of ourselves that are asking to be tended to. Those things are essentially just needs that are eager to be met. And so if we are talking about being sovereign beings, how is it that instead of relying on an external source to find that healing for us, that we take the initiative, that we are our own advocates in finding pockets of pleasure, finding pockets of joy amidst the darkness, amidst the pain?
Yeah. I love that. And I love what you said about it being like a compass or a guidepost for us, you know, when we're in those emotions. And how unrealistic is it for us to expect happiness 24/7? We're miserable because we're not happy, but it doesn't really make any sense because it's unrealistic to have that expectation of happiness all the time and not facing, you know, those other parts of ourselves that are valid. You know, they're real sides of ourselves that we need to pay attention to. And so one part of ourselves as a collective is the narrative around colonization. And it's something that I like to speak to you about because I know that you do a lot of work around this and you understand it. And I'm still learning about it and learning the impact of colonization on our narratives as a collective and also as individuals. How can we kind of, I don't know if this is the right word, but how can we remediate colonization in our society? How can we be more present to it and more understanding of what actually happened? How can we rise from that and heal ourselves and each other? I think that was about 6 questions, but anyway, I'll leave it with you.
Hmm. Well, first, I think it's important that we begin to acknowledge that we are all on occupied land.
Yes.
Even for myself, as somebody who is not indigenous to Southern California, that I am considered a settler as well.
Yes.
And that when we talk about colonization, it is something that has had a global impact, but I think it's also important to start with where it is we are at. And so, from what I know, I am here in Long Beach, California, which is home to the Tongva and the Chumash people.
Mm.
And I know that there's many other nations named and unnamed here that we may never know about
Mm-hmm.
because of the brutal history of colonization, and to also acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are still here today fighting for their rights. And so when we talk about healing, it's also important for us to acknowledge that the land we are on is built on trauma.
Mm.
And so when we are doing the healing for ourselves, how is it that we can begin acknowledging
Mm-hmm.
that this system was built on the backs of slavery, was built on the backs of immigration, and
Mm.
then looking at ways we ourselves have benefited from this.
Mm-hmm.
And then not sitting in that guilt or that shame, but then asking, what is it that I can do to contribute back to the sovereignty of those who whose rights have been taken?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know that for myself as a quote unquote empath or highly sensitive person, something else I want to say about that is that each and every single one of us are actually empaths. It's just that somewhere along the way it was taken from us. Therefore, many of us have learned to cope by dissociating,
Mm.
detaching ourselves from those deeper emotions. I was heavily involved in the realm of social justice. And I would still say I am, but it has manifested in a different way to where I am doing my best to feel like the pain and suffering of the world is not my own. And
Yeah.
that one of the most radical things I can do in this body as somebody who has experienced sexual trauma, and as somebody who grew up in this system, to where, again, the ways that I've been able to cope with the world is through study,
Mm.
right? One of the most radical things I can do is reclaim this body as mine, to be comfortable as a sensual being, and to recognize that for me to be in my joy and in my pleasure is a part of the healing of the collective, is an invitation for others to also step into that place.
Mm.
That we don't have to ignore the anger and ignore the sadness,
Mm.
ignore the fear, but we can bring those with us on the journey to be as fuel and become alchemists in transmuting that into the very emotions that we have been shamed of experiencing.
Mm.
So when I think about what reclamation or decolonization can look like for me, uh, it begins there.
Mm.
And I am very wary of using that term as well, because I, again, want to acknowledge that much of that is rooted in the First Nation peoples of the United States and
Yeah.
of Canada. And I also think it's a place where we get to explore
Mm,
what that can look like for us as we may be finding an alternative term.
mm. Yeah, and I really love what you said. Thank you so much for all of that. I really love what you said about not sitting in the guilt and the shame, but looking for ways where we can acknowledge, like be acknowledging of what has happened and what is happening, and finding solutions for the way that we have been acting as a society, you know, towards each other, and especially to the First Nations that were here. I live in Canada on an island that is unceded land, and I'm also an immigrant to Canada. I came from Europe when I was a child, so I understand like what if I understand what it feels like to be an immigrant, because there's a negative side to that, and there is also a positive side to that. And I also understand what it's like to live on land that I understand has been taken through trauma. And while I don't want to be sitting in shame and guilt, at the same time, I don't want to say I'm not in awareness, or I don't have any responsibilities, that happened a long time ago and I have no responsibility towards that now. And I think that that is something that we all need to talk about, is what are responsibilities now to ourselves, to our narratives, you know, the stories that we tell and the stories that have shaped us, and what is our responsibility to further now, living in this world where reclamation must happen. So um,
And can it happen alongside the people who have been impacted the
yeah.
most?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, especially for many of us who are stepping into the realm of healing, I witness, particularly in this industry, the rampant cultural appropriation of these
Mm,
healing traditions that I don't think we should be doing if we are also not actively working alongside those whose ancestors brought this wisdom to us.
yeah.
And so when I think about how colonization has impacted every single one of us, it's how I see many people feel the need to take on someone else's culture as
Mm,
their own without doing the exploration work of how perhaps their own culture and their own ancestors have a beautiful healing tradition.
mm,
Even if you're somebody who identifies as white, if you want to look beyond the wrongdoings of your ancestors, or even if they weren't directly your ancestors, your association with them simply by the color of your skin, what about the witches? And I know,
mm,
Monica, this is the work that you do
mm.
as well, which is why I feel so connected to the medicine that you're bringing to this world. Also, another mutual friend like Tula, it's
Mm.
like we need more people like you to say, like, we do have a beautiful culture,
Yeah.
we do have a beautiful healing practice, and now it's time for us to reclaim that. And I don't think that that means you are completely banned from using cultural healing practices that are
Yeah.
not of your own lineage, uh, but I also think it again is important to explore what gives me access to this, and whose traditions have been taken as a result of me being able to utilize this today.
Yeah. So much that, so much what you're saying right there. I am, and so much more in awareness now than I was even a year ago of what my practices are, the stories that I'm telling, how I'm telling those stories. How am I showing up in the world as a mentor and a witch? Who am I taking that from? You know, there's so much to unpack there, so much to unpack there, so much to think about, and I'm so grateful for your awareness around that, and then you also bring that awareness to all of us. and help us to understand it, because it's easy to crawl back into our cave and say, I don't want to hear about that. That feels really uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about me being white and there being colonization. And I don't want to hear about how somebody else suffered, because it hurts me and it's unpleasant. And the thing is, if we don't sit around the same fire together and we don't share those stories together and we don't have compassion for each other, nothing is going to change, and we're going to keep on going around in this circle of abuse and trauma. And those are the things that I know we are both, and others who we know who are friends of ours, are trying to transmute and bring, towards the light. So I so much appreciate all your words and what it is that you're sharing in your work and how you show up in the world. And I'm learning from you every day. And I'm excited to share this interview with the universe so that others can also open their own conversations and perhaps change their own narratives or accept their narratives, however that shows up for them.
Yeah, if we are not able to have these courageous conversations that are often uncomfortable, then those stories will turn into stagnation in our bodies and can manifest as something else later on in our lives or be passed on to the next generation. So I also think that alongside having these conversations with people who have vastly different backgrounds and experiences than us, from a place of deep listening versus the need to prove something or tell a story where my experience is worse or better than yours, that we do have these spaces where we can sit alongside people who have similar experiences and do that healing work alongside each other first.
Yeah.
This is why I think it's important that we have spaces solely for women or solely for people of color. We have these affinity groups where we can even look at the ways that we have unknowingly harmed each other as a result of internalized oppression. And then when we can get to this place where we can have these conversations with people of our own kin first, especially with our families, then it becomes easier to take that out into the world. So I believe that that within itself is also a part of the collective healing. And this is why for myself, I have a group program that I'm starting off solely with people who identify as women of color, because they themselves have expressed how they don't see many people who have taken on leadership roles who look like them. And I don't want representation to be an issue any longer, that we get to step into the roles that we have been waiting for. So I'm excited to reframe those stories we've been sharing ourselves as well around lack.
That's so important. It's so important. And I'm so glad you're doing that work, because people also ask me, I attract a certain type of client and you attract a certain client. Do you know what I mean? And it is important to have those spaces where we are safe to be ourselves and we know that we are heard and we are seen. And so I applaud you in your work. Where can people find you? What is your website, and where can they find out more about your programs?
So you can actually go to yourstorymedicine.com.
Okay.
That'll be the easiest place to find me. And from there, I would love to hear the story that you're shaping as well. And how is it that we can work to reframe that in a way that is in service to the collective, where we're not staying in the pain and the muck. And that doesn't mean that we don't tell those stories, but
Yeah.
we also do the work to talk about what that reclamation is looking like for us.
Mm.
And if you are somebody in the position of a healer, how your own lived experience oftentimes makes you even more of an expert than all the certifications behind your name.
Mm.
It's
Yes.
just a matter of being able to tell that story in an embodied way so that your services and your offering can truly be medicine for the masses. But really,
Mm.
your services and your offering is you,
Exactly.
your
Yeah.
radical, deep, loving presence.
Yes. Yes. So true. Well, thank you so much, June. I am so honored and pleased to have had this conversation with you, and can't wait for everyone else to hear your wisdom as well. And I'm sure we'll have other conversations, because you talked about so many things that I was like, ding, 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 we got to talk about that as well. So we will meet again. And I thank you so much for the courageous way that you're showing up in the world.
Thank you, and happy second Saturn return.
Yay! Thank you. And we'll see you again in Conversations with the Universe.